I do believe that Palestinians have a right to violent resistance. Now, that's not an endorsement of Hamas. That's not an endorsement of October 7th. But I think it's really important to frame the conversation in a way that leaves room for that, because I think it is inhumane to ask a people to go through what Palestinians have gone through and to ask them to lie down and die in a way that would never be asked of people who are not brown or not Black. They have a moral and ethical and political right to resist a military occupation with a military force.
So this isn't necessarily about stopping the current conflict in Gaza alone. It's almost more about stopping the enterprise that is Israel, that Israel has been since the 1940s.
Yes, because you have to recognize the war as a natural end result to the Zionist project.
I'm Andy Mills, and you're listening to Reflector. Wars, like the one that's being fought right now between Israel and Hamas, are not only fought on the battlefield, but they're also fought in stories. Today's episode is an interview with an American academic who is telling a story about Israel that, while it remains controversial and is much disputed, is one that is gaining influence throughout the country, especially on college campuses. I suspect that the story she tells, and many of her beliefs, will differ from many of you who are listening. For example, she doesn't believe in the legitimacy of the State of Israel at all. She views Israel not as a sovereign, independent nation, but as an unjust European colonialist project. She believes that Israel is losing the current war, which she calls a genocide, and she believes that President Biden should be arrested and imprisoned. These are all views that are factually contested. Some are even seen as anti-Semitic, and as we mentioned in the last episode, they remain on the fringes of American politics. But there is ample evidence that they are growing in popularity. In a recent Pew survey, 34% of Americans under the age of 30 say that Hamas's reasons for fighting Israel are valid, and only 16% of Americans under the age of 30 believe that the U.S. should continue to supply military aid to Israel to help them win the war. Now, before we get to the episode, I know that in recent years, there has been a rejection across much of the media landscape for values like objectivity and fairness, and a move towards what some call a pro-democracy or moral clarity stance on journalism. This can often lead to outlets only speaking to people or reporting on stories that they think their readers, their listeners, or their subscribers agree with. For example, when I was at the New York Times and we would interview someone on the right, like Steve Bannon, or we would profile an influential figure like Ben Shapiro, there would often be a public outcry from critics who accused us of platforming dangerous people with ideas that they believed should be excluded from public discourse. Sometimes celebrities would even publicly cancel their subscriptions, or staff members would quit in protest. I understand this view, but I disagree with it. I think it is essential in a pluralistic society that members of that society try their best to understand the beliefs of their fellow citizens, especially when those views are gaining influence. In my experience, it is a powerful thing to listen to others, whether or not you see eye to eye with them. And while I do jump in on occasion to give broader context or to ask a tough question, that sort of listening is the purpose of today's episode. It's not a debate. It's not an attempt to promote or to debunk the claims of my guest. Rather, it is the opportunity for all of us to hear a story that is gaining significant purchase in our culture and having a growing impact on world affairs. As always, you can reach us at hello@reflector.show. Feel free to send us your feedback, your criticism, and your story suggestions.
sounding good.
All right, cool. Well, thank you for doing this. Can we start off by having you just introduce yourself, your name, and whatever title you'd like us to use today?
Yeah, my name is Iman Abdelhadi. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Chicago.
And what do you teach?
I am a sociologist. I teach in the Department of Comparative Human Development. My work is on Muslim Americans.
Comparative human development.
Yeah.
How do you think we are developing right now?
Poorly. No, I'm just kidding.
This is Iman Abdelhadi, an activist and organizer with the Free Palestine movement, a professor at the University of Chicago, and an American with Palestinian heritage. Can you tell me a bit about your background and how you came to be a part of and even a leader in this Free Palestine movement?
So I'm half Palestinian. My father was Palestinian. So I've been concerned with this issue my whole life. I really grew up thinking about Palestine, talking about Palestine, learning about Palestine. I think as early as middle school, I was giving school presentations about Palestine. I remember one time one of my classmates saying, "Can you please give a presentation about anything else?" Because, he had heard different variations of the same presentation.
And did you grow up in the U.S.?
In part, I was born here, and then we left when I was small, and we lived all over. We lived in Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, and then I came back when I was 9.
Iman spent most of her life growing up in Columbia, Missouri, where her parents immigrated from Egypt, and where they raised her to retain an identity of solidarity with her father's parents, who had been residents of what was then Palestine. What is the story that you remember learning as a child about what had happened to the Palestinians and why there was this conflict between Israel and them?
I mean, the story that I learned growing up was that there was massive Jewish migration from Europe into Palestine in the early 20th century in response to oppression in Europe, and that there was British rule in Palestine, just like there was all over the Middle East. And that the British basically worked out a deal with the growing Zionist movement to give away Palestinian land. That effectively the British gave away the land to Israelis under massive pressure, and people were forced out of their homes or were killed, including my own grandparents.
Sorry, your grandparents passed away in...
They weren't passed away, they were forced out of their homes. Israel basically has been stealing Palestinian land ever since, that it's been expanding its project.
Iman, like many in the Free Palestine movement, often trace the conflicts today all the way back to Israel's foundation 76 years ago.
This is still consistent with what I believe. The problem was the creation of a Jewish supremacist state.
On May 14th, 1948, David Ben-Gurion, who would soon become the country's first prime minister, declared the birth of the State of Israel to the cheers of many Jews around the world still reeling from the aftermath of the Holocaust. But within hours of that speech, and in some ways within hours of its founding, Israel was at war. The armies of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon all attacked the newly formed state on several fronts. And here is where competing views of history still fuel one of the most divisive conflicts in the world today. Since ancient times, the region that is in dispute today has largely been ruled by outside empires. There were the ancient Romans, who renamed the area Palestina after they had suppressed a Jewish uprising. There were Muslim caliphates and Christian crusaders. And then, for hundreds of years, the territory was a part of the Ottoman Empire. Then, after the Ottomans were defeated in World War I and the Ottoman Empire was disbanded, control of the region was placed under British authority by the League of Nations. Now to the contested part. After the Second World War, and in the aftermath of the Holocaust, which had resulted in the deaths of millions of Jews, the United Nations proposed a plan that would pull the British out of the region and divide the land into two independent states, to be governed by the people who lived there. One would be governed by the Jewish people, and the other governed by the Palestinian Arabs. The Jewish delegation accepted this UN plan, but the committee that was representing the Palestinians and the neighboring Arab states rejected it. So, from the Israeli perspective, this is what caused the 1948 war: the Arabs' rejection of the UN plan and their decision to collectively attack the new nation. Israel saw this as a war for their survival and independence. But for many Palestinians and other Arabs, the UN plan was simply unjust, especially because it gave half of the country's territory to the Jewish people, even though Jews only made up 1/3 of the local population at the time. These Arab countries viewed their military response as an act of defense, protecting Palestinian homes and communities that would now be ruled by Israel. During the war that followed, more than 500,000 Palestinians fled the region, and thousands were expelled, many believing that they would return to their homes once the fighting stopped and Israel was defeated. But that never happened. Israel shocked the world by winning that war. Today, Israelis celebrate that victory as their Independence Day, while many Palestinians refer to that same event as the Nakba, which means the catastrophe. Internationally, the war has often been viewed with far more nuance, but for those like Iman, it's not complicated.
I think this conflict never ended. The Nakba never ended. The Nakba has been ongoing.
And Iman goes even further and says that the same injustices and racism that were at the root of the Holocaust were an ideology that was also foundational to the establishment of Israel.
I think there's no question in my mind that Zionism in its origins was a white supremacist project. Was that project born out of a reaction to a severe injustice? Absolutely. And a racialized one? Of course. 100%. But Zionism was an ideology that sought to sort of reclaim that superiority vis-a-vis the Palestinian native, a superiority that had been sort of withheld from Jewish people in the European context.
This is a view that largely has its roots in American academia in the late 20th and early 21st century, and has been made more popular by activists like Angela Davis and more recently by movements like Black Lives Matter. However, the idea that Zionism is at all connected to white supremacy is seen as deeply offensive and ahistorical to many, especially Israelis. Critics of this view point out that Jews are not seen as white by white supremacist groups who have long persecuted them, and that fewer than half of Israeli Jews are of European descent. The majority come from Middle Eastern or African ancestry. But this is a debate that has grown more widespread since October 7th of last year.
Let's go back, if we can, to your upbringing in Missouri. What was your impression growing up of America, not just in this conflict, but in general?
Pretty poor. I mean, there was a kind of a dual reality because my parents met in the U.S. They had both already migrated to the U.S. previously and met each other here. And, you know, they both really liked their lives in the U.S. They had strong communities in the U.S. So there was a sort of like social attachment to the place. But politically, the U.S. was seen as an imperial power, that it sort of ruled over the Middle East in the sense that it influenced policy in every direction. You know, I don't even know if I should tell the story, but when 9/11 happened, and, you know, obviously we were all just horrified by, like, the deaths and the like, just the terror of it all. But I remember speaking to a teacher and she was like saying something, you know, this was in mid-Missouri, but she said, oh, you know, I just don't understand why they hate us and all this stuff. And I, being 11 and having no filter, was like, what do you mean? Of course they hate you. I was like, of course they hate us. Like, the whole world hates us. Like, the U.S. has done terrible things in the world. And continues to do so, you know? And I knew that at 11 even.
But if that's sort of the hate side and the love-hate, what was the love side?
There's love because it's home and it's the place. I mean, I've lived abroad at various points as an adult and, you know, there's no place that I will ever understand better than I understand the U.S. And there's no place that understands me better. I'm a foreigner. outside the US more than I am inside of it. Like the minute I open my mouth, I am American, and it's home. Plus, it pisses people off so much that I'm staying. All the assholes on Twitter that are like, leave. If you don't like it, leave. I'm like, I think I'll stay just because it bothers you.
And I respect the contrarian nature. And in some ways, it's very American.
Yeah, it is very American. That's true.
Vice President, why are you risking the end of democracy, the rise of fascism, the return of Trump to protect Netanyahu's war on children? You are not the protector of democracy. We are the protectors of democracy.
Iman has been an activist for Palestinian causes since she was a student, where she supported the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Since October, she has been marching against the Biden administration's policy in the region. And in August, she was one of the organizers of this year's march on the DNC.
Vice President, you have a choice. You could join a movement for justice. You could make a place for yourself in history. You could be a leader who chose to listen to her people rather than the interests of the war manufacturers. Or you could become a war criminal.
Are you a Democrat? Have you ever been a registered Democrat? Do you usually vote for the Democratic Party? What's your relationship to the Democrats?
Yeah, I'm usually a registered Democrat. I think I am a registered Democrat now. My first election, I think, was Obama in 2008, and I canvassed for him. I felt the hope. I had a tote bag with the Obama Rolling Stones cover on it, which I think still lives in my mom's house somewhere. I didn't vote for Hillary in 2016 because I lived in New York and felt like I could afford not to vote for her. If I were in a swing state, I would have voted for her. Absolutely. I was very terrified of Trump. I remain terrified of Trump.
But it was a protest vote or
It was a protest vote. Yeah. I mean, I still voted. I just voted. I think I voted for Jill Stein. And then I voted for Biden in 2020. I encouraged other people to vote. I talked people into voting. I took people with me to vote. And so, yes, I am a Democrat in the sense that that's the party I've voted for most in my life, and that's the party I've tended to register for.
Where is it you're aligned with the Democrats? Why do they feel like the party for you? And where is it that you feel that you and the Democrats are, worlds apart?
I'm with them on abortion. I'm with them on unions. I'm much further to the left of them on immigration. And I'm with them on reproductive rights, queer rights, trans rights. But I part ways with them in that they are still so beholden to corporate interests and the interests of billionaires and the ruling class. And I think that plays a huge role in Palestine. I don't think it's, I think there are people who make a lot of money from those weapons deals. And it's not ideological for them. It's that we literally give Israel money that they then use to buy weapons from American weapons manufacturers. So, yeah, where I differ from the Democrats has traditionally been on foreign policy, in that, traditionally they haven't been that different, actually, from the Republicans, at least in deed, if not in word.
Mm-hmm. We're living at this time where there feels like it is a very short list of things that Democrats and Republicans agree on. Mm-hmm. And Israel is one of them. That a vast majority of Democrats in elected power throughout the Democratic Party and a vast majority of Republicans who hold power, they do agree on the importance of Israel as an ally and on supporting Israel. Why do you think that issue draws them together? Why in this time when there's so much partisanship does this issue unite Republicans and Democrats?
I think it's because of corporate interests. I think that the American, ruling class, billionaire class is very invested in Israel. I think particularly the military industrial complex is very invested in Israel. It's not public opinion, right? I don't think it's a matter of the Jewish constituency because Jewish folks under 40 are very split on Israel and sometimes have even more progressive views on Israel than the average American. So I don't think it's that. I don't think it's about their votes. So, the question becomes, what is it? And the thing that we know about American politics is that it's so influenced by money. There's a revolving door between these industries and government. And so I think that that's where that investment comes from.
How should we understand the goals of the corner of the Free Palestine movement that you feel like you're a part of? What would it look like for the movement that you're a part of to win, to get what you want?
I think in the long term that the U.S. needs to cut Israel loose in terms of economic, political, and social support. And I think the first step right now is a weapons embargo. This genocide is not going to end unless Israel stops getting an open spout of tools to enact it. But I think ultimately Israel needs to be sanctioned. It needs to be boycotted. It needs to be divested from. So that's winning to me.
I've heard some people describe the protest movement as a peace movement or an anti-war movement, but I've also spoken to some protesters who say, actually, what we want isn't pacifism. Mm-hmm. What we are here for isn't anti-war, it's anti-colonialism, it's anti-Israel.
I do believe that Palestinians have a right to violent resistance. I want to make that very clear. They have a moral and ethical and political right to resist a military occupation with a military force. Now, that's not an endorsement of Hamas. That's not an endorsement of October 7th. But I think it's really important to frame the conversation in a way that leaves room for that, because I think it is inhumane to ask a people to go through what Palestinians have gone through and to ask them to lie down and die in a way that would never be asked of people who are not brown or not black. They have a right to resist occupation and to resist the guns in their faces.
I guess what I'm saying is this isn't necessarily against stopping the current conflict in Gaza alone. It's almost more about stopping the enterprise that Israel has been since the 1940s.
Yes, because you have to recognize the war as a natural end result to the Zionist project.
Let's talk a little bit more about how you understand the Democrats and where they're coming from. I've been to several of these protests, and one thing that you commonly hear, and we've heard it since October, is Joe Biden is a terrorist, Genocide Joe, the DNC, I've seen some people calling it the GNC. Have you heard this?
Yes,
the Genocide National Convention. Help me understand how best to interpret that sort of language. Is the idea that President Biden literally has done terrorism and maybe should be tried with war crimes? Is the idea that Joe Biden and many of the Democrats want the killing of all Palestinians? Mm-hmm. Is it better understood as you're using maybe hyperbolic language to get attention and to say, hey, we really mean it, and we know this is a bit insulting, but we're trying to get your attention and maybe nothing else will?
If you told me I want to shoot up a mall and I handed you a gun, I'm a murderer. That's what Joe Biden has been doing for the last 10 months. So yes, he is a war criminal. Joe Biden is a war criminal. He is a mass murderer. If we lived in a just society in any way, he would be tried. We don't live in a just society. We live in the heart of American empire. We are in a moment where we are constantly being gaslit about the reality of the world around us, right? We're told, no, these people really want peace. And meanwhile, they're handing billions and billions of dollars of weaponry to a state that cannot stop killing children. So I think statements like that are an attempt to reclaim our reality, to say you can't gaslight us about what we are watching every day, right?
This isn't hyperbole, in other words.
It's not hyperbole to me. I hope Joseph Biden never experiences a single moment of happiness ever again. I hate that man. If he had any shred of morality, right? He would have intervened in some serious way in what we've been seeing. I don't think Biden has his hands clean any more than LBJ did, or Nixon, or Kissinger. These people are mass murderers.
I think what Joe Biden and some of his allies would say to these accusations is that, look, Hamas took American hostages. They took Israeli hostages. Hamas did this violent attack on October 7th. And if Hamas would give the hostages over and admit defeat, essentially surrender, it would end the war. And Hamas won't. And that essentially the blame should be on Hamas, not on Israel. How do you respond to that?
I think the people who are responsible for the death of the civilians are the people killing the civilians. If you're going to use that logic, then Hamas's actions are actually a result of Israel's actions of a 16-year siege. If we're going to do this logic where we blame the other side for what each side did, then let's go back. Let's go back. Let's go back before October.
Because you're confident that if you go back to the beginning, Israel is clearly the aggressor, and most of what's been done in the name of Palestinian rights is more justified.
Exactly. Yeah. So why would Hamas surrender? What could possibly give them any reason to believe that Israel wouldn't continue to annihilate Palestinians or continue to subject them to military rule? Of course they will. They are not winning the war. Why is Israel losing this war? It's a nuclear armed power with the backing of the biggest military to have ever existed in the history of humanity. And yet, they seem to still be losing soldiers and tanks and whatever, because we know that guerrilla warfare is actually extremely effective.
I think that the argument that I've heard from their side is it's because they're being too careful and they're trying to make sure they care for civilians and they're not going to drop the worst bombs. They have way more might, and that the reason that they might not be totally annihilating is in fact that they aren't interested in genocide, that they do want to some way have peace with the people there and find a way to remove Hamas and some distant day perhaps repair the damage that's been done.
I think that's pure nonsense. The problem is that we in the US have long seen Israelis as human beings and Palestinians as not human beings. And that's why when Israelis say these things that are so obviously not true, they're given a lot of benefit of the doubt. And the sort of Palestinian side of the struggle is seen as immediately suspect. Everything from the death tolls to who actually bombed the hospital. And it's the same cycle.
I understand that there's a lot of media skepticism on the part of many of the protesters. I've seen a lot of protesters who have aggressively pushed the media out of their spaces, that there's a deep sense of distrust there. What do those of us in the media get wrong? Mm-hmm. What critique would you, as a part of this movement, want to voice to those of us who try and cover it?
I think there's a tendency to sensationalize protests. I think there's a tendency to homogenize, to, treat everybody at the protest as the same, to sort of like pull out the things that confirm, to show like one clip that confirms a predisposition that audiences might have to sort of malign the protest. And I don't think that's just our protest movement. I think every protest movement in U.S. history has had this treatment. I think the media needs to do what you're doing now, have Palestinians speak for themselves, but also pay attention to the way that these stories get told, who gets humanized and who doesn't. We deserve nuance too,
What is the philosophy behind the kind of protests that you do? Where does it draw its power from?
Yeah.
It does feel to me, covering these protests, speaking to different members of the protests, that there are different strategies, I guess you would call them, at play, different philosophies undergirding it. And I wondered if you could help me understand the purposes of some of the more, I guess you might say, intimidating aspects of the movement. There are a lot of people who, quite frankly, seem on the edge of violence. They're very antagonistic towards the cops. They're using words that, were they just a person walking down the street saying words like this, I would call them fighting words, right? These really big insults, sometimes personal attacks, saying things that are really provocative. Should we understand that as maybe on the one hand, this is going to get attention, and it takes a lot these days with all the kind of media that's out there to get any attention. So this will draw some attention. And maybe also it is to kind of show power that we're not just a bunch of weaklings. We didn't come here to get the hose or to get the dogs from Bull Connor. This isn't MLK Jr. in 1965 here. We have a backbone. We have a fist that we're going to raise, and don't mess with us. Is that how you understand it?
Yeah, I think that's always been that's the Panthers showing up in black and carrying weapons and walking into the state legislature fully armed, right? But I also think that, people take on this kind of demeanor for a bunch of different reasons. But I think it is a part of, it's part of protest culture in a sense because, okay, if you think about the cops, right? The cops are I'm an abolitionist. I hate the cops. I was on the streets in 2020. I was on the streets for BLM. And the reality is we are subjected to so much state violence, right? Like we walk around and these people have guns and have almost immunity to kind of do whatever they want to us. And I think that people in protests often take on this demeanor as a sort of attempt to face off against that violence, to name that violence for what it is.
To say we have power too.
We have power too. And that you are the violent one. The irony of us calling that violent, right? Whereas like the people with the riot gear and the assault rifles, we don't think of as violent, right? There's this way that we invisibilize state violence to say, this is okay. This one is fine. This isn't violent. This is fine. We're okay with this. And these guys over here, the ones that are shouting mean things at a protest, they're the violent ones.
Yeah, words aren't violence.
I don't think so.
After a short break, I ask Iman to respond to some of the criticisms surrounding the Free Palestine movement, including accusations that they are inspiring anti-Semitic violence, and whether a conflict that is this complex is something that a protest can help. Stay with us.
Hello, this is Matt with Reflector, and this episode is sponsored by Ground News. Ground News is one of the most helpful tools that I use every day to avoid the echo chambers and media bias online. One of my favorite ways they do this is by providing a service they call blind spots, where they show you a story that's disproportionately covered in the media by only one side of the political spectrum. For example, a recent story that was a blind spot on the left was about an Economist YouGov poll that revealed that most Americans think that Kamala Harris is insincere.
Vice President Harris, when it comes to the economy, do you believe Americans are better off than they were 4 years ago?
So I was raised as a middle-class kid, and I am actually the only person on this stage who has a plan that is about lifting up the middle class and working people of America.
And that she tells the public what they want to hear instead of what she really believes, while her opponent, Donald Trump, is viewed as more genuine. A recent blind spot on the right was another poll that showed that a majority of Republicans surveyed said that they were more likely to trust Donald Trump's claims about the outcome of the 2024 election than they would the government's certification process.
Will you accept the results of the election, regardless of who wins? Yes or no, please.
If it's a fair and legal and good election, absolutely.
The radical left Democrats rigged the presidential election in 2020, and we're not going to allow them to rig the presidential election in 2024.
On top of showing blind spots, they also showcase competing headlines on the same news item. They collect local reporting on the city or town that you live in, and they rate news stories and outlets on their level of bias. To go check them out, use the link ground.news/reflector, and you'll get 40% off their unlimited Vantage subscription. This is a great way to support them and the work that they do because Ground News is a subscriber-supported platform. We appreciate what they're up to. We appreciate their support of this podcast, so go check them out. And make sure you use our link, ground.news/reflector, so they know we sent you.
Hi, this is Megan McArdle, a Washington Post columnist. Reflector's team and I recently did 3 episodes about stolen elections in American history. I wanted to tell you about another podcast where you can hear from me and my colleagues at the Washington Post Opinions. The show is called Impromptu, and each week a group of columnists get together to process the news we can't stop thinking about. Some weeks we talk about the big hits, presidential campaigns and Supreme Court rulings. But other weeks we dig into the questions that come up in our everyday life. Whether to buy an electric vehicle, why home buying feels impossible, or why airline travel sucks right now. Search for Impromptu wherever you listen.
One thing that may stand in the way of a Democrat like Harris wanting to be seen as giving too much credence or attention to your movement is some of the criticism that fairly or unfairly the movement has received.
Sure.
And I'd love to get you to respond to some of it. One of them is just that there are many people who have been attending these protests who openly support Hamas.
Mm-hmm.
Recently, someone spray painted Hamas on a statue of George Washington in Washington, D.C. People often display Hamas flags. They dress as Hamas fighters. And in some ways, they sound as if they're championing Hamas's movement, their philosophy, and what they did on October 7th. And what some critics will say is that to support this movement, to give it too much credence, is akin to almost supporting terrorists, or at least terrorist sympathizers. What do you say to those critics?
I would say that, first of all, movements are heterogeneous, and I think those images get a lot more play than 99.9% of the images that you see walking around at a protest. I think if people are supportive of Hamas, we have to ask ourselves why that is, where that comes from, especially like some of the images I've seen, are like these white kids that are like Hamas, and I'm like, okay.
Well, no, I don't want you to gloss over that.
It kind of makes me wonder who those kids are and how they ended up there. I mean, it's not it's not a secret that, every protest movement in the U.S. has been heavily surveilled, monitored, and intercepted by the FBI and the CIA. I mean, that's not like COINTELPRO. We have, there was reporting on how the Black Lives Matter movement was. I don't think anyone's ever not been to a protest and not seen like the obvious like undercover cop. But anyway, so I don't know who those people are. I don't know where they're coming from. But I think it is disingenuous to hold the entire movement to their behavior.
Relatedly, a lot of critics will point to the fact that since October 7th, it's not just been a small fringe, but that some of the leaders, some of the big speakers at a number of rallies have said things that they are afraid of, that they feel fear about, including, people saying death to Zionists, the idea that Zionists are just a puppet state of the U.S. and that they thirst for the blood of the Palestinians. On Columbia's campus, one of the organizers got into a lot of trouble when it came out that he had said in a Zoom call, Zionists don't deserve to live. And a lot of people will say that, okay, maybe it's not everyone, and it's bad to paint with a broad brush. But you can't argue it's just a few fringe people. It keeps showing up, rally after rally, protest after protest. There keeps being scandals where the leaders of some of these movements are getting caught saying some of these things. And they'll say that you have to at least acknowledge that part of what's fueling this movement is a hatred of Jews or a desire to destroy Israel, and that you need to grapple with that, or that the movement hasn't policed its borders enough or searched its soul deeply enough about whether or not it's aligned with a hate movement. What do you say to those people?
I think that this is there are so many logical steps in what you just said, right? That it's like first people saying things, they're mad at Zionists, and then they go a little too far, right? They go too far, like saying all Zionists should die. Like that's obviously too far. And then to kind of say that this is all scary and therefore it must be that part of the movement is fueled by anti-Semitism. I think there are many logical leaps in that like progression.
Death to Zionists, or celebrations of October 7th, or from the river to the sea. Some people will say that Hamas helped to popularize this saying from the river to the sea. In 2012, one of their leaders used from the river to the sea to say that they would not give even an inch of land to the Zionists, Jewish occupiers. And essentially we're saying that we want to get rid of all the Jews from this land. And a lot of people, when they hear from the river to the sea, they put it in the context of that's a thing that Hamas has been saying for years. You'll also hear some people bring up the Intifada revolution, and they'll say, well, in the last Intifada, there was a whole lot of suicide bombs. There was a lot of terrorist attacks on innocent civilians. And they'll say they're calling for suicide bombs. They're calling for terrorism. Their leaders are saying things like death to Zionists. They're spray painting and vandalizing Jewish synagogues and homes. There's been desecration of Jewish symbols. I mean, there was even some people who vandalized Anne Frank's statue, had a lot of people upset. And they'll say, your movement is not grappling with just how much hate has been associated with it. And therefore, Kamala Harris and the DNC and these Democrats, they would do well to stay away from that movement. They don't want to be stained with the association of a movement who does things like that.
So, I don't want to. I think it's one thing to respond to these critics. It's, I think, another to give credence to the idea that they're putting forth. I don't call for death to anyone, Zionist or Jewish, but I think critiques of Zionism are often misconstrued as critiques of Jewish people writ large. I think the other question is whose fear gets to make policies? Because yes, there has been vandalism. There have been instances of vandalism against Jewish homes and Jewish establishments. But I think that we need to grapple with the racism of the narrative that you just presented. There's an inherent racism to the narrative that says, well, these people are secretly out here and they're like scary. They're so scary. Some people's fears matter and some people's fears don't. It's hard for me to even respond to that narrative because I hesitate to even legitimate it.
Even somebody who hears all that and agrees with you that this is largely a fringe element, that we shouldn't see these videos that go viral and think that is representative of the entire movement. Mm-hmm. One thing that critics will still say is, yeah, but you keep showing up and marching beside them, and that reveals something about your character. And one of these critics I recently heard compare it to what happened at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, that there were a lot of people who went down there, some of whom, for whatever reasons, just didn't want that Robert E. Lee statue taken down. But when they saw the people with the tiki torches chanting, "Jews will not replace us," they got out of there. Mm-hmm. And then at the second Unite the Right rally, there was very few people there because people just didn't want to be associated with people who spoke such hateful aggression. Essentially what they're saying is, doesn't it say something about your movement that you're willing to work and march alongside day in and day out so many people who do spout these hateful things?
I think it's, first of all, having been to so many of these protests, having been an organizer, there is so much internal management that happens actually around these people. There's a lot of work that goes into being like, hey, stop it, stop doing that, or we're going to move from this group or whatever. So I think that the Zionist critic you mentioned has probably never been to one of our protests to see this. The other question is, what does it say about your character that you are willing to work with a government that has just killed 40,000 people, most of them children, women and children? And that's what's more concerning is what people are saying on the street than, like, it's just absurd, the double standard. I mean, it's just mind-boggling, actually.
You're saying those people are just worried about the wrong
Well, first of
thing.
all, I think often those critics decide that something is hateful and then jump to the next step before we get to debate whether the thing is hateful or not.
You would dispute some of the claims they're making about hateful speech or hateful action.
Definitely.
But even
the ones that I would agree are hateful, I think are extremely rare, are often policed by other people in the protest, are often managed. A lot of these protests have marshals, they have organizers, but at the end of the day, how much can you control?
Do you think that maybe this is one of those situations that's so complicated that there's no way to like protest your way through it? That the only way to make peace or to bring about a better future than the recent past is to do something other than stand in the streets and protest? In other words, is this one of those problems that a protest just can't help?
No, in part because we've been doing all the other things. We've tried all the other measures. We've tried the international community. We've tried the UN. We've tried, people talk about, Palestinians, why are they so violent? Why did October 7th happen? Palestinians have tried every measure to get freedom, both in Palestine and the diaspora. And protests have been an enormous way of changing public opinion in American history. Protests have triggered some of the biggest changes in American life. And yes, I do think it helps. I think it energizes people. I think it, coalesces the movement. I think it changes public opinion.
So you're saying you do have faith that this can make real change?
I have a lot of faith. I mean, because I've been thinking about Palestine for so long, I know that there's been massive change in political opinion and level of awareness on Palestine, not just since October, but really already people's awareness of the issue had grown so much. We were already able to say things and think about things that would have been kind of unimaginable in the context of when I was an undergrad, for example,
What are some examples of that, maybe?
Being able to question whether a two-state solution is the only possibility for the region, being able to explicitly name Israel as an apartheid state, being able to name the racism at the core of the Israeli project and Israeli society and the way that it's organized. I think being able to also name the fact that Palestinians have attempted resistance in so many forms, and that resistance has been met with violence, right? And so thinking about Palestinians as agentic, as having a right to stand up for themselves, whether that's through protests or whatever else,
Things that just were not even popular on college campuses, let alone in the public imagination 10 years ago. And now you're seeing them on social media and you're hearing them from a larger and larger swath of the population.
Exactly. Yeah. We've seen, even the last 10 months, the amount of change that's happened in American public opinion around this. I don't think that would have happened if we had all stayed home and decided it was too complicated. We'd be in a very different place right now.
One year after Hamas's deadly attack on Israel,
we remember infants, toddlers, children, teenagers, adults, seniors.
Dozens gathered for a candlelight vigil outside the state capitol.
We are doing it in community because that's what we do.
On the anniversary of Hamas's attack on Israel on October 7th, throughout the United States, the competing stories about Israel were on full display.
What started out as a small group of protesters marching through the Claremont colleges soon became a group of several hundred.
4, 6, 7, 8, Israel is a terrorist state.
These pro-Palestinian protesters blocking the entire intersection at North College Avenue and East 6th Street in front of Pomona.
While many Jews around the country met to remember the dead and the hostages still held by Hamas, protesters in several cities and colleges took to the streets.
Earlier today, dueling protests on the campus of Columbia University, different sets of students holding rallies and honoring victims of the terror attacks in Israel and those protesting Israeli military action in Gaza.
This is a day that's supposed to be about remembering Jewish life, and they're actively celebrating that attack.
On October 7th, the brave people of Gaza broke down an apartheid wall that shattered Israel's victim narrative.
In the last year, we have made a lot of progress. We have been able to put this issue on the map.
At one point, the protesters stormed Carnegie Hall and blocked many of the doors. Some students telling us the only way they could leave the building was to climb out of a window.
And while the war in the Middle East continues to escalate, so do the dueling stories being told about that war right here at home.
From the moment the protests kicked off on Wall Street, there was confrontation and a steady drumbeat of piping hot hostility.
Flags, flares, and angry threats in Madison Square Park tonight, where hundreds rallied into the evening, protesting the Israeli response to October 7th, determined to shift the focus from a day of solemn remembrance to a day of outrage.
By demonstrating today, are you condoning what happened a year ago?
I think it would be fair to go way back before October 7th of 2023 and look at the history and look at the facts and look at all the proof we have of what Israel has been doing as an illegal settlement.
This episode was produced by Andy Mills and me, Matt Bull, with help from Megan Phelps-Roper. Our thanks to Aman for speaking with us, and our thanks to you for listening. If you'd like to support our journalism, you can become a paid subscriber by going to the link in our show notes or by visiting us at reflector.show. We'll be back soon with more stories.